African American Legends highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, and drama. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they've been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I am your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr. On today's program, we'll discuss the biography of the legendary Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. with the author, Dr. Charles Hamilton, Professor of Political Science at Columbia University. And Chuck, as we call you, what led you to write this book about this really interesting, pioneering African-American politician, minister, speaker from Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem?
That's the reason, because he was all those things, Roscoe. And I'm a political scientist, and I wanted to, I was always fascinated with his career. In addition, it was getting on to 2 decades after his death. As you indicated, I teach at Columbia University, and beginning in the late 70s, throughout the 80s, I could mention Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. to my students at Columbia College, and they never heard of him. Never heard of him. They were aware of a street up, a building up the street called a State Office Building, and so I found that to be unacceptable. And then when I began to do the research, it became clear to me that this kind of this book ought to be written. I'm referring now, and you're gracious enough to let me say this to you. I think that all this discussion on multiculturalism and so forth is really not doing justice to the basic subject. Some people, colleagues who are anti the multicultural thing and think that there's too much emphasis on Afrocentrism and so forth. And when they do research and they include African Americans and they tell you how proud they are, you should see some of the work they do. There's a fellow at the City University of New York Graduate Center in History, Professor Diggins, who wrote a book, The Proud Decades, and he talked about the United States from 1941 to 1960. He mentioned Powell, Adam Clayton Powell, and he talked about Franklin Roosevelt's 4th election. And he said here, and I think that your viewers ought to, he says, he's talking about how President Roosevelt won widely in 1944. And he said the president also brought in on his coattails William Fulbright of Arkansas to the Senate, and Helen Gahagan Douglas of California, and Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. of New York's Harlem to the House. I read that, and I've been reading other kinds of things. I said, let me write a book on this man. Because if you believe what this professor at CUNY said in his book about Powell, that Mr. Powell was elected to Congress on FDR's coattails, then you've misunderstood.
You missed another decade of African-American history.
First of all, Adam Powell won. He ran on every ticket. Democrats, Republicans, ALP, and Communist Party. It would have been very difficult for him to lose under those circumstances to begin with. If you miss that point, then you miss the role of the church in the black community at that time, not just religiously, but politically. And you miss a tremendous amount of the cultural dimension.
And you miss the role of the press.
Well, of course, of course. So it was very important to write not just this book, but others like this. It's a long-winded answer, but I knew I wanted to say this for the day you asked me to come on, because I'm sick and tired of the shoddy scholarship that goes on with these critics.
And we talk about African-American legends on this program in business and politics and theater and so on. And so frequently you find that the essence of African-American legends is just lost in the panoply of time.
Oh, yeah.
And one thing is necessary to understand what makes a person. For example, as we will see from some of the pictures, Adam Powell was light-skinned, straight hair, many times could have been mistaken for white, maybe many times acted like he was white.
And earlier in his life, as a student at Colgate, for a brief moment passed for white. When in the first year he was at Colgate. He just didn't tell anybody. Then he was found out.
And yet, what we find that he became the prototype for fighting for African American rights, integrating the cafeteria. He could have walked in that cafeteria in the House of Representatives and not be known as black, but he went specifically with a very dark-skinned black person so that they would know that, and those are the kind of things that Adam Powell did. But let's tell us a little bit, as you crafted this book, how did you craft it? Because you can't talk about everything in a great person's life. How did you craft the book?
Very quickly, you're right. Born, lived, died with an awful lot of facts in between. That's one way to approach it. It was very clear to me that this was, as you indicated earlier, a very controversial fellow from the beginning of his public career through the end. And it was also interesting and very clear that he evoked different reactions from people for looking at the same entity. And it was very clear that he centered his total early and later public life around the issue of racial justice and economic justice, but beginning with racial justice. And he left he lost no opportunity to raise what we call normally the American dilemma. You preach one thing, you practice another. A lot of people think he went too far. A lot of people think that when he flaunted his race in the white barbershops and so forth, he was going too far, that he was becoming ineffective. When he called Mrs. Truman the last lady of the land, they thought that was improper. Some people thought it was absolutely what he should do. And so he was, in many ways, then, it is, as I say in the subtitle, a political biography of an American dilemma, because you and I and others reacted to him based on how we view the American dilemma. I didn't care, I didn't want him to insult Mrs. Truman, but I was glad he raised the issue.
Because that's the issue.
Because that's the issue. That's the issue. Now, if it takes that to get people's attention, and remember, you're talking now 1940s, you're not talking 1970s and 80s and 90s. So he was just an epitome of the irritant, as he liked to be called. And he was just independent enough, self-confident and independent enough, both materially and otherwise, to play that role.
Well, how much of this came from his father, Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Sr., because the story of Abyssinian Baptist Church is a story of itself. And as I read the book, and I've read other things about his father was a far-seeing fighter, and the way they got the money to build that church and move it up there into Harlem at a time when Harlem was just beginning to be the capital of the black world itself was something. And then this beautiful boy comes into this marriage, and he's being crafted. Was Powell crafted, molded to be this leader, or did he fall into it because of his great father?
I don't think there's any question, based on all the evidence I was able to look at, that his father wanted he wanted the son to succeed him as pastor of Abyssinian Baptist Church. I think that, although the father denied it several times.
Well, a lot of black preachers have done that.
Oh, sure.
Martin Luther King and so on. And it's
I'm not
it's a
evaluating
tradition.
There's no question of that. And that's what happened. I think that his father, once his son achieved that role, then I think that his father was wise enough to know that wherever else the son went, he better stand back and just watch, as he did. And so the turn toward electoral politics was Powell Jr.'s decision, naturally. The scene was opening up. He went to the city council, then he went to Congress. But it was never, I think, in the bones of that family to be a retiring parish minister. It would always, I think, as the father did, combine the pulpit and public action.
To put this in perspective, at the time Adam Powell was elected to Congress, there was one black congressman.
William Dawson from Chicago.
That's right. One black congressman.
Who was 180 degrees opposite in style not necessarily in overall views, but certainly in style, from Adam Powell, didn't raise issues, would never go to the segregated barbershop in the House. But he came out of a very different political environment, Roscoe. William Dawson came out of the tight machine Cook County Democratic Party.
In Chicago,
In
for those who
Chicago.
don't know where Cook County is, right?
Okay.
Right, see,
Well, you're right.
Chicago.
Fine, fair enough. Yeah, I just assumed being from Chicago that those things are worldwide known. Anyway, fine. And you thought 2 or 3 times before you bucked the machine, and the blacks in that city didn't really begin to do it until after the 1960s. Here, Tammany Hall was there, but you could challenge as LaGuardia did and so forth. And it was much more of an independent-based politics in this town, in New York City. And Powell understood that. A lot of people understood it. And he crafted his political career based on Harlem, that church, and from there, that was always his base. And he never, in the 30-plus years he was really on the scene, close to 40, he never left that base. And the time he did, at the very end, it was the base that really brought him down. You know, they voted him out. I mean, a lot of people, he was kicked out of Congress, but he was back. But the base voted him out.
Well, let's talk about that. But before
Yeah.
we do that, I was particularly interested in the section about his role as a kingmaker in the Johnson administration.
Oh, yeah.
He was, as the chairman of the Health, Education, Labor Committee, he was the kingmaker for Johnson's Great Society program,
Yeah.
which now, interesting enough, is being criticized as being the cause of all our problems, which I certainly, and I know you don't, think that really is
Well,
the case.
the
But
60s,
let's talk about it.
yeah, the 60s, some people describe today in hindsight, it was not the 60s that I lived through and enjoyed and came to maturity on and politically. But anyway, that aside.
Newt Gingrich could probably take, as a history professor, he could probably take a history lesson on the 60s, because
He'll
some of the
have
things
his own
that
version
he's
of
saying
history.
is really
Yeah.
not the case.
Yeah. Powell bided his time, took a lot of insults in the 40s and 50s, wouldn't even be given a subcommittee under the committee chairperson at that time.
It was Sam,
Finally,
Sam Rayburn, right.
Finally, in 1960, he became chair. This man, I think that in terms of his political career and his vantage point then, he wanted to be either and possibly both things, a chair of a powerful committee, he achieved that, or Speaker of the House. And if he'd kept his health and stayed in, he could have become that, probably, maybe. But as chair of that committee, 40% of the domestic legislation came through his committee. Now, at that time, with the particularly post Kennedy's assassination, and he was chair in that vibrant period of the 89th Congress, 64 to 66. Legislation came through his committee. Now, one might say, but this was a liberal time, and that's true, and a lot of people could have played the same effective role, but it's also very clear that when the White House needed something, how to handle Edith Green from Oregon, Democrat, who was being persnickety on certain measures and on science education. It was Powell who crafted the rapprochement that got them through that. So it was those little bitty things, you know. So people have said to me, well, look, it was easy to be a chair of a liberal committee during liberal times. Well, maybe not. There are a lot of, and it just lasted 2 years, I mean, that liberalism. There's a big difference between whether an amended bill gets amended in this way or in this way, you see. And that was the value of this man's chairmanship.
What about the times when he would put on these Powell Amendments?
Oh,
He was
yeah,
dealing
yeah,
with
yeah,
significant legislation.
Well,
That was before he really got the power.
Well, that was in
but,
1950s.
But he would put on these Powell Amendments. He was able actually to integrate the school lunch program by doing that.
Look, it basically was in the 50s, before the Civil Rights Act of 64 and Title VI. And after a long period of the civil rights groups trying to say, give us civil rights and these social programs. You know, we want both. We have a dual agenda here. Finally, the NAACP, Clarence Mitchell, and Powell, the two major ones in that sense, in the 1950s, no. If you don't cut out racial discrimination and segregation, we're going to not support liberal programs for school construction, hospital construction, housing, and so forth. And these became known as the Powell Amendment. It rent the liberal community apart because they said if you tack on these amendments requiring desegregation and non-discrimination, that will defeat the bills. So what? Too bad. We've tried it the other way for years. And this was the power, that was, Roscoe, your viewers should know, that was the delicate, wrenching issue in that time, 40s and 50s, as quotas and affirmative action is today, you see. Oh, you could get a fuss going on in the liberal community. The conservatives stood aside and loved it, you know. But finally, and so he never backed down. He didn't back down, and Clarence Mitchell didn't back down, and it took them both. Finally, 1964 Act, Title VI was the one that did it. And Title VI implemented the Powell Amendment. So in that sense, he was vindicated.
Well, before 64, Kennedy had been elected in 60.
Yeah.
Powell supported him. We have pictures of him supporting Kennedy. We know there are some other blacks, including Jackie Robinson, who supported Nixon.
Oh, yeah.
And because they felt the Republicans would do more than the Democrats, because the Democrats would talk liberal up north and talk segregation down south. What was Powell's relationship with Jack Kennedy?
Very good. They liked each other, and I frankly think, and I have no evidence for this of a very hard nature, but I think they frankly liked each other's style. Mm-hmm. They were both quite personally, politically attractive, and I think now, the one thing I think that Kennedy admired about him, and vice versa, they were both, in their own way, ethnic politicians. Mm-hmm. Kennedy understood Harlem politics. Whether he, went and did as much as he should have, and he didn't, or not, is one thing. But he said, Kennedy once said, and I'm sure he must have had the rising, burgeoning Adam Powell's in mind, you have to understand how I got here to be president by understanding my Irish Catholic Boston base. Mm-hmm. And so they were two of a kind. And plus, I think they were center-left, liberal. Powell far more than Kennedy, but he was president. Johnson was different. Here, let's count, and let's count the votes. And Adam Powell understood that.
But Johnson also believed that this was necessary for the country to continue to grow.
No question.
I think Kennedy did too, but Kennedy was far more conservative because of his own ethnic roots and background.
But also, I think that let's be very fair to Mr. Kennedy on this. That man had a kind of Clinton type of Congress. He didn't have a Congress.
That's right.
He barely won, as we know. He had a slim majority. He was, plus he had no clout personally in Congress. Same with Mr. Clinton today. Johnson just the opposite. In the 89th Congress,
he had all the clout.
He had all the. He was majority leader. And he had a lot of people owing him, and plus he had this huge margins in the 89th Congress. So that was a very different environment. And finally, the Johnson people always respected Powell's power.
And his intelligence.
Oh yeah, oh
And
yeah.
and
No,
his-
no, no. They, no. In all his flamboyance, Powell, and I think this might have been a disservice to him, his flamboyance at times masked what I perceive to be his good grasp of the issues, particularly when we paid attention. I had a couple of staff people, Dr. Wolf, Deborah Partridge Wolf, who was on his staff early in education. And this is a person who would have no reason now, 30 years later, to misrepresent, talked about how he could, when he put his mind to it, and that was more often than people think, he would master the intricacies of of an education bill. And he would get fidgety at hearings, but when it came time for markup or where he had to sit down and really go, he was more substantive than his public persona, the strutting, flamboyant fellow would
What
suggest.
did you say? He has a avenue, 7th Avenue, named after him. He has a building named after him. He's considered to be one of the icons of
Yeah.
African American political leadership.
Yeah.
Yet at the same time, you could almost say he ended his life with disapproval, if not disgrace.
Yeah.
What led to that, and what lessons can contemporary African American politicians gain from that?
Well, quite frankly, and I don't want to be too polemical, but this is such a delightful discussion of it as well. I think he miscalculated. I think that he actually, he did misuse committee funds. Now, there's no question of that. He did, at times, go back on his word.
But he said the white politicians did the same thing.
Oh, no. Oh, absolutely, sure.
And
No,
therefore,
wait a
they were
second.
given
Yeah,
a double judgment.
He did go on junkets, but so did a lot of other people. Fine, that's a miscalculation. He actually thought, I believe, that he could act like all the others.
Right.
And I'm going to say to you, and I think that it's, whether we like it or not, that was a presumption he was not entirely able to make in racist America. Now, there's no question that he did no more nor less, and I'm quoting him now, than others have done. Junkets, wife
Employees on the payroll, right? Even today.
Well, of course. And as that subsequently came out,
Right.
some of his severest critics in Wilbur Mills
Yeah.
and Wayne Hayes and so forth.
Fannie Fox and so on.
Okay, so it did come out, but so what? Plus he was, by his lawyers, one of his lawyers' accounts, inattentive to this ongoing libel suit that was brought against him by one of his constituents. He called her a bag lady. Your viewers will go look it up if they don't know what it is. I don't have time to explain it right.
Somebody who carried money
Well,
for
you-
people doing illegal things.
To the police.
To the police, right.
Okay, fine. And she sued him. And it just went throughout the courts. And his lawyers were trying to work with him. He wouldn't show up. It was just,
And he certainly wouldn't apologize.
Oh my goodness, no. And so he got a suit of $250,000 against him. Well, no one ever thought Adam would pay that. And he strung it out, and I went through some of the documents. I'm not going to see. And it was just, and he was cited for civil contempt and criminal contempt. Then he stayed away for a year, except on Sundays when they couldn't
And that's where he
serve him.
began to erode his base,
No
and his own
question.
community
No
began to be
question.
eroded.
Which is the most important. But first, he began to run into trouble with his colleagues, and he was holding up funds on labor legislation until the OEO program, particularly the HRU Act, got more funds, and people thought that was for his purposes. Oh. So then, September '66, his own committee cut his powers drastically. And from that point on, Roscoe, he was doomed in the House. And indeed, a few months later, they voted not to seat him. And he was excluded for a year and a half, but he took that case to court, won it. because it was unconstitutional to exclude him. They could take him in and then decide to censure him or something. But so, and he kept running for re-election and getting re-elected. But it was also very clear that if you look at those numbers from 66 to 68 and so forth, they were going down. Adam was getting less and less of the primary. He was being challenged in primary. Can't be challenged in general election. So he went back. The Supreme Court ruled in June '69 that he had to take his seat back. They cut his salary, made him pay back some of the money he'd misappropriated. And at that point, the man had cancer. He was dying, and he knew it. And the fight was out of him.
And then that led to the election of Charles Rangel,
in
who has
1970.
been in Congress for those many years.
Do we
As
have
we come
30
to
seconds for
yes,
me to
we
tell
do,
you that
because
I
want
met
to
him
get this-
one time. I had 3 contacts with him, but I met the man once. It was the spring of '70. We were at a speaking engagement together in Ohio, and he was running. Charlie Rangel was running against. I said, you should shouldn't you spend more time back there in the district? I mean, I hear this is a tight election. He sort of knew of me. We were on the program together. He looked at me and he says, "What do you teach?" This is a quote. It's not apocryphal. He says, "What do you teach?" I said, "Political science, politics." He says, "Where?" And that characteristic put down, Adam Powell. I said, "Columbia." He said, "They ought to fire you." He said, "I can't lose."
Okay, that's a good point on which to conclude our discussion. This has really been an exciting discussion about your biography of Adam Clayton Powell, Jr. Professor Charles Hamilton of Columbia University has been with us, and we've been having really a wonderful discussion. Thanks again, Chuck, for being with us to talk about this African-American legend.